Des US-Präsidenten sind nicht rechtmäßig, urteilt.
Cour suprême est jugée illégale.
It's upended global trade yet again. Trump's tariffs making headlines around the world.
Plus, the potential impact on Canada.
A reminder, what happens in the US doesn't stay in the US.
Inconstitucionales.
The decision by the US Supreme Court yesterday is less about what tariffs we have slapped on us in the UK and more about losing our advantage compared with everyone else. Some 40,000 UK companies export goods to the US, but there are always winners and losers. No extra tariffs for things like cars and pharmaceuticals, but chemicals and industrial products losing a comparative advantage. Trump may have directed his ire yesterday domestically at the judges who went against him, but his focus was also on what it means for foreign businesses, who may now be eligible for refunds of taxes that the US Supreme Court says shouldn't have been levied.
And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you.
This business, which makes popcorn in London, one of a few that say they definitely haven't been dancing, forced to cut back their US exports like many food and drink businesses.
America is the home of popcorn, so for us to be exporting to America is like mad from a kitchen table business where we started. Unfortunately, since tariff announcements last year, the uncertainty that's created and the extra cost as well has really damaged that business. So we'll be focusing a bit closer to home this year. We're actually doing a lot in the Middle East now as well.
A whole stream of UK products are currently tariffed at 10% on top of the duties already in place before last April. But many other countries have been paying more, like Canada at 35%, Mexico and India at 25%, and the European Union and Japan at 15%. Yesterday, President Trump announced that the 10% rate would apply across the board to all countries. But he now says he's raising that to 15% with immediate effect. Whether that applies to everyone isn't clear. But it's uncertainty that's the issue here.
We now have a situation where companies don't have clarity about what the tariffs are going to be 6 months from now. And that is going to damage investment. It will damage confidence and willingness to want to trade into the US market. And companies may be looking at other markets, for example, Europe and Indo-Pacific, as more stable alternatives, given this flux in tariff policy we're still seeing.
Trump has nodded to the fact that this will all go through a long legal process. No clear answer as to if or when UK businesses will see their share of the $175 billion worth of tariffs that are due to be refunded.
The UK government says this whole thing is a matter for the US to determine, and it will be working to support UK businesses here while the details of that are announced. It also says that it expects the privileged trading position it enjoys with the US to continue, and that it will be looking to work out how tariffs will impact the UK and the rest of the world.
In other words, it hasn't got a clue what's next either. The US wants the UK's ride or die, now more of a ride it out and hope for the best.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the economist Neil Shearing from the independent research consultancy Capital Economics. I asked him for his reaction to President Trump's announcement.
Well, it gives us a sense of where we are in this process, doesn't it? That we have a tariff regime that has been torn up in this sense by the Supreme Court and then replaced by another by President Trump, a 10% global tariff, now replaced by a 15% global tariff 24 hours later. So I think the big picture here is there's still an enormous amount of uncertainty about exactly where this tariff regime will end. However, I'm pretty certain that when the dust is settled, we'll end up in a situation where US tariffs are substantially higher than was the case, say, 12, 18 months ago.
Keir Starmer must be watching Donald Trump's social media posts through his fingers right now. I mean, how do we know what tariff we're subject to in the UK? We thought we had a special deal.
Well, I think part of the problem was that the deal itself was never quite as special as perhaps was made out at the time. It was a pretty thin deal. It certainly didn't have the approval of Congress. And of course, that's the issue here. That's what the Supreme Court have ruled about, is that it's Congress that gets to decide how to regulate foreign commerce, not the president. So the fact that it was a deal between Starmer and President Trump is perhaps the issue.
Yeah.
So you're right, for the UK and for any other country for that matter, matter that has done a bilateral deal with the US, that is now effectively up in the air.
The UK had this sort of special carve-out for some sectors like pharmaceuticals and steel, but everything else, there was 10% yesterday. If a US buyer was taking some Scotch whiskey yesterday, that was going to be 10%. Now it's going to be 15%.
Now it's going to be 15%, unless there are specific carve-outs for individual products or sectors. And it appears that the powers that the president is using to impose tariffs could allow for some carve-outs for some sectors, but we just don't know yet whether or not he will do so.
What does this mean for global trade?
Well, I think that's part of the answer to the question. Who knows, to some extent. However, as I say, I think there's two things we can be reasonably sure about. The first is that US tariffs are going to be materially higher at the end of this process than they were at the start of the process, at the start of the Trump presidency. The second, though, is that the global trading system has been remarkably resilient over the past 12, 18 months in the face of these tariffs. And I think that will remain the case. Supply chain is incredibly adaptive, and I think we'll continue to see that adaptation play through over the next year.
Neil Shearing, thanks for your time.